The stage was not a stage. It was a platform assembled from wooden ammunition crates and discarded supply pallets at the edge of a military airfield, hastily hammered together by mechanics whose hands were still stained with grease and aviation fuel. The audience was several thousand soldiers sitting on the ground, perched on the hoods of jeeps or standing in the back, still in their dirt-stiffened uniforms. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, damp earth, and the metallic tang of impending rain. Some of them were not yet done with whatever brutal, exhausting labor they had been doing before a rumor rippled through the camp like a sudden change in atmospheric pressure. Louis Armstrong was playing. He walked out with the trumpet in his hand, followed by the band, their shoes crunching against the gravel. He stepped onto the warped wooden planks and looked out at the crowd. These were not the audiences of the velvet-lined concert halls in New York, nor the smoke-filled electric nightclubs of Chicago. There were no clinking highball glasses, no waiters whispering through the aisles, no critics sitting with their notepads. These were men who might not be alive in 6 months. Some of them would not be alive in 6 weeks. You could see the fatigue etched into the lines around their eyes, a collective exhaustion that seemed to drag on their very bones. They were boys, mostly, wearing helmets that looked too big for them, holding rifles they had learned to clean before they had learned to shave. He raised the trumpet. The brass caught the weak afternoon light, a sudden blinding flash of gold against the drab olive green of the war zone. He brought the mouthpiece to his lips. He played. Louis Armstrong's contribution to the World War II effort was not complicated to understand, at least on paper, and was not something he elaborated upon extensively in the press afterward. He was a performer, the greatest performer of his era. The USO needed performers to remind the boys of home. He was asked to go. He went. This was how he thought about it, and the simplicity of the description is accurate in its own pragmatic way. He showed up, he unpacked his horn, he played until his lip bled, he packed up, and he went where he was sent next. But the thing he was doing while he was doing it was not simple. It was infinitely, crushingly complex. Not for a black man in 1944. Not for a man who had grown up in the crushing poverty of New Orleans under the suffocating grip of Jim Crow. A man who had spent his entire adult life navigating a country that extended its celebrated freedoms selectively and with a precision that was, in its own way, a dark, deliberate kind of art. He was performing for soldiers who were crossing oceans to fight for American democracy. He was performing as the very embodiment of American culture, jazz, the freest, most democratic music ever invented. Yet, he was performing for a country whose democracy had never included him, or the men in his band, on equal terms. He carried this contradiction everywhere, as heavy as the luggage he hauled from train to train. It was not unique to the war. It was the fundamental, inescapable condition of his existence as a black American man of his generation. You loved a country that did not fully love you back. You were asked to be its shining ambassador, to export its joy and its genius to the world, while being asked to use the service elevator to reach the stage. You made music that the country celebrated, music it danced to, music it built its very identity on, while the country simultaneously maintained brutal, systemic architectures designed to keep you in your place. You navigated the vast, yawning gap between what the country said it was on its founding parchments and what it demonstrably was in its streets, its restaurants, and its voting booths. And you did it every single day, often multiple times a day, with grace or without grace, depending entirely on the day. The military performances added a specific, jagged dimension to this lifelong navigation. These soldiers staring back at him were not all white. The United States military in 1944 was still officially, rigidly segregated. Blood plasma was segregated. The mess halls were segregated. The barracks were segregated. And so the audiences were segregated. Armstrong sometimes performed for black units separately from white ones, which meant that the same show, the exact same notes, the same sweat, the same Louis Armstrong was being presented through the apparatus of a system that was supposed to be fighting fascism abroad while diligently practicing its own version of it at home. He did not comment on this publicly in 1944. He was careful in the way he had been taught to be careful, a survival mechanism honed over decades in a society quick to punish a black man who spoke out of turn. There were things he said with his famous wide smile, and things he didn't say. In 1944, the calculation about what was safe to say was made with the exact same improvisational genius and split-second precision he applied to his chord progressions. He played. He smiled. He wiped his brow with his trademark white handkerchief. He gave the troops exactly what they had come for, which was an hour of absolute, transcendent music in the middle of a mechanized slaughter. But those who traveled closely with him, the sidemen, the road managers, noted that after certain shows the atmosphere in the dressing tent shifted. After the ones for segregated units, the ones where the military police literally drew lines in the dirt to separate the black mechanics from the white infantrymen, the ones where the contradiction was made most brutally visible by the very structure of the event, Armstrong was quieter than usual. Not angry in a loud, visible way. He didn't throw things. He didn't shout. It was a quietness in the way a man holds things that are too heavy to set down. He would sit on a folding chair, staring at the floor, slowly dismantling his trumpet, wiping the valves down with an intense mechanical focus. But then there were the anomalies. There was a show somewhere in the Pacific Theater. The exact island location has been disputed in different historical accounts, lost to the fog of war and the unreliability of memory, where the rules temporarily, miraculously, ceased to exist. Armstrong was performing for a crowd that had assembled informally, organically, outside the official segregated structure. Someone had simply dragged a flatbed truck into a clearing, word had spread through the humid jungle canopy, and men had come running. Black soldiers and white soldiers sitting shoulder to shoulder in the same muddy field, leaning against the same palm trees, passing the same canteens. They were listening to the same music, breathing the same heavy air, not because the army brass had suddenly decided it was appropriate, but because they were all exhausted, they were all far from home, and because nobody with enough rank had yet arrived to stop it. People who were there, musicians and soldiers alike, said Armstrong played that show differently from the rigidly segregated ones. They said there was something completely untethered in the playing, a fullness, a fierce abandon, a soaring velocity that was not always present in his standard set list. He didn't just play the notes, he attacked them. He stretched the melodies until they nearly broke, his gravelly voice echoing through the dense foliage like a sermon. It was as if he recognized the fragile, fleeting nature of this unauthorized gathering. He played as if the arrangement in front of him, this mixed, integrated sea of human faces, brought together by nothing but his horn, was the way things should be. And he was going to give it absolutely everything he had in his lungs while the illusion lasted, before the officers arrived, before the lines were drawn again, before the reality of America reasserted itself over the dream of it. The tours eventually ended. Armstrong came home from the war zones and went back to his career. He went back to the dressing rooms, the recording studios, The calculations and the navigations of a managed existence as a famous, wealthy, yet still deeply restricted black artist in mid-century America. The war ended. The confetti fell in Times Square. The troops came home. But the country did not immediately become the thing it had been fighting for. The black soldiers who had liberated European towns returned to a nation that still forced them to the back of the bus. Jim Crow laws remained firmly, violently in place. The lynchings continued. The segregation persisted in housing, in education, in opportunity. The fundamental freedoms that had been theoretically worth bleeding for on the beaches of Normandy and the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima were still violently theoretical for the very people who most needed them to apply. He played anyway. Louis Armstrong always played anyway. Some younger activists would later criticize him, mistaking his smile for compliance, mistaking his survival tactics for surrender. They didn't see the subversive triumph of a black man forcing the entire white world to recognize his undisputed genius. The music was the point. The art was the rebellion. And the music did not wait for the country to become what it should have been before agreeing to be beautiful. The beauty was the demand. There is a rare piece of paper, a letter Armstrong wrote late at night during the war. Not for a newspaper publication, not for a press release, just a private reflection meant for himself and a close friend. In it, he described a single, fleeting moment at one of the overseas shows in the bitter cold of the European theater. He described looking down from the makeshift stage and locking eyes with a soldier who had been sitting near the front. It was a young man who appeared to be in his late teens, his face smeared with engine grease and dirt, his uniform far too thin for the biting wind. And this boy was crying during the performance. Not in a dramatic, sobbing way, just crying, quietly, silently, while the music played. The tears were tracking clean lines through the dirt on his cheeks. It was the particular, quiet way that people cry when something profound sneaks past all their emotional armor, bypassing the toughness required for war, and reaches the soft, hidden place they've been fiercely protecting since they kissed their mothers goodbye at the train station. Armstrong wrote that he kept watching the young man for a long moment between songs. He watched the boy wipe his face with a filthy sleeve. He wrote that, standing there, holding his golden trumpet, he thought about what was waiting for that specific soldier. He thought about the artillery shells, the mud, the terror, the very real probability that this boy might be dead before the week was out. He wrote that he decided something in that exact moment. He described the decision only obliquely, without grand philosophy, but the meaning was clear. He decided that the music was a sacred offering. It was worth giving completely, holding nothing back, emptying the soul every single time, to whoever was in the room, whatever the room was, and whatever its societal contradictions. Because the young man crying near the front of that wooden platform had not come to write a sociological essay about racial contradictions. He had not come to fix the broken systems of the United States. He was a boy facing death, and he had come because he needed to feel human again. He had come because Louis Armstrong was playing. And Louis Armstrong decided, in that shivering, freezing camp, that he was going to play as if that were enough reason for everything, as if the music alone could build a roof over the world. He wiped his mouthpiece. He brought the trumpet to his lips. He closed his eyes, and he played the next song. Years later, the war long over, and his status as an international icon cemented, Armstrong was asked about those USO tours in a quiet interview. The interviewer expected anecdotes about celebrities or the thrill of travel. Instead, Armstrong grew profoundly serious. He said they were among the most vital, important performances of his entire life. He explained that performing for combat soldiers was entirely different from performing for any other audience on Earth, because the stakes in the room were completely different. He said you could physically feel what was at stake: life, death, sanity, memory. And that invisible pressure changed everything about how you played. It changed the air in your lungs. It changed what you gave. He looked at the interviewer, his raspy voice dropping to a low rumble, and said, "Those boys needed something real. And music is about as real as anything gets." The contradictions of the era were real. The brutality of segregation was real. The agonizing gap between what the country claimed to be on the radio and what it actually was on the streets, that was real. And it was not magically resolved by the signing of peace treaties, nor by the end of the decade, nor even entirely by the end of Armstrong's life. But so was the music. The music was untouchable truth. So was the young soldier crying near the front of the stage, remembering his home. So was the unauthorized crowd in the Pacific, sitting shoulder to shoulder, forgetting their differences in the face of a walking miracle. So was Louis Armstrong, standing on a pile of wooden crates, his horn pointed toward the sky, playing as if the racial gap didn't exist. For 1 hour, in a muddy field somewhere at the edge of the world, he gave the troops every ounce of spirit he possessed. All of it, the ugly and the transcendent, the hypocrisy and the sheer brilliance, all of it at once, was the absolute truth of what America was in 1944. Louis Armstrong didn't hide from it. He showed up, he unpacked his trumpet, and he played right in the turbulent, messy, beautiful middle of it. That was what he did. That was the genius of his art. That was who he was.